When Amaka married Dennis, she believed marriage was a quiet partnership, one built on patience, understanding, and shared sacrifice. Dennis had been charming then, ambitious in a way that felt hopeful rather than hungry. He spoke about the future as our future, and Amaka believed every word. She adjusted her life around his dreams without complaint, convinced that love sometimes meant stepping back so another could move forward. In the early years, their small apartment felt full of promise. Dennis talked endlessly about business ideas, while Amaka listened, encouraged, and sometimes gently corrected him. What she didn't notice, then, was how quickly her voice began to disappear from decisions. Dennis would say, "Let me handle this," and she would agree, thinking trust was strength. Silence slowly became her language, not because she lacked opinions, but because expressing them often ended in dismissive laughter or irritation. Still, she stayed hopeful, believing the imbalance was temporary, believing marriage required endurance. Over time, Dennis's ambition hardened into control. He began to frame his dominance as responsibility, his authority as leadership. When Amaka raised concerns, Dennis reminded her of everything he was doing for the family. Slowly, he rewrote the story of their marriage, casting himself as the provider and her as the dependent, even though much of his early progress came from her unseen labor. Amaka managed bills, organized paperwork, followed up on emails, and learned the rhythms of his business long before it became successful. Yet Dennis rarely acknowledged this. Instead, he encouraged her to rest more, to stay home, to let him handle the important matters. Each suggestion sounded reasonable, even loving, but together they built a cage so subtle Amaka didn't realize she was inside it. She learned to swallow frustration, telling herself that peace was better than conflict, that patience would eventually be rewarded. By the time Dennis's company began to grow, the silence between them had become permanent. Amaka watched as her husband transformed into someone sharper, louder, and more certain of his superiority. He spoke with authority she had never seen before, especially when others were watching. At home, he was distant. In public, he was grand. Amaka remained in the background, invisible but essential, carrying knowledge Dennis underestimated and loyalty he took for granted. What Dennis never understood was that silence does not erase awareness, it sharpens it. While he assumed Amaka knew little, she observed everything: patterns, documents, habits, and truths hidden behind confidence. Their marriage had become unbalanced, but not empty. It was quietly storing something Dennis never anticipated: memory. The first major compromise came disguised as concern. Dennis suggested Amaka pause her university education, insisting it was only temporary. He framed it as a sacrifice for their future, reminding her that his business needed focus and stability. Amaka hesitated, but Dennis spoke with such certainty that doubt felt selfish. She agreed, promising herself she would return later. That promise slowly faded as months turned into years. Instead of classrooms, her days filled with household responsibilities and administrative work she never formally claimed. Dennis trusted her with emails, passwords, and bank alerts, not because he respected her intelligence, but because he assumed loyalty equaled ignorance. Amaka learned the language of finances quietly, absorbing knowledge without announcement. She became the unseen engine behind Dennis's progress. She tracked payments, followed up on late invoices, organized contracts, and scheduled meetings. Dennis praised her efficiency, but never her intellect. Whenever she suggested improvements or raised questions, he waved them off, saying, "Leave business to me." Yet he relied on her more than he admitted. Amaka noticed contradictions in his behavior, how he needed her competence, but resisted acknowledging it. She also noticed something else. Dennis rarely read the documents she prepared. He signed where she pointed. He trusted without understanding. That trust would later become his greatest mistake. Amaka told herself compromise was temporary, that marriage involved seasons of imbalance. Still, a quiet ache settled within her. She had traded her growth for stability, her voice for peace. Dennis thrived, expanding his influence, while Amaka shrank socially, emotionally, and professionally. Yet beneath her silence, her mind remained active. She remembered everything: numbers, dates, signatures, habits. She learned Dennis's patterns, so well she could predict his decisions before he made them. What Dennis saw as submission was actually observation. And observation, when paired with time, becomes power. When Dennis's business finally succeeded, wealth entered their marriage, but respect did not. Dennis celebrated publicly, boasting about his journey, rarely mentioning Amaka, except as a supportive wife. Properties were purchased quickly, all registered in his name. When Amaka asked about joint ownership, Dennis laughed, calling it technical nonsense. He assured her everything he owned was for the family, yet insisted paperwork remained solely his. Amaka felt the distance grow wider, her contributions fading into history rewritten by confidence. As Dennis's social circle expanded, his arrogance hardened. He enjoyed being admired, being envied. At gatherings, he spoke over Amaka or spoke for her. She became an accessory, not a partner. Dennis controlled finances tightly now, questioning her spending while indulging his own. Still, he left accounts and documents open to her, assuming familiarity meant harmlessness. Amaka noticed irregular transfers, unfamiliar names, and unexplained expenses. She said nothing. Silence had become strategy. Dennis mistook Amaka's calm for emptiness. He believed dominance meant victory. What he didn't see was the quiet shift happening beneath the surface, how Amaka's awareness was deepening, how her patience was no longer submission but preparation. Success had inflated Dennis's ego, blinding him to the one person who understood him best. The first signs of betrayal did not arrive loudly. They crept in quietly, disguised as exhaustion and ambition. Dennis began coming home later than usual, his excuses polished and repetitive. Meetings ran long. Calls needed privacy. His phone, once left carelessly on tables, now never left his hand. Amaka noticed everything, not because she was suspicious by nature, but because years of silence had trained her to observe patterns others ignored. When she asked gentle questions, Dennis responded with irritation rather than reassurance. He accused her of overthinking, of turning normal work pressure into drama. His words carried a sharp edge now, cutting down her concerns before they could fully form. Amaka felt the shift deeply. The warmth that once filled their home thinned into something fragile, something tense. Dennis spoke less to her and more at her, often dismissing her presence entirely. At night, his body faced away from hers. In the mornings, his mind was already elsewhere. Still, Amaka said nothing. She had learned that questioning Dennis often resulted in punishment disguised as logic. Instead, she watched. She listened. And slowly, the pieces began to connect. The woman entered Dennis's life long before Amaka saw her face. She arrived first as unexplained transactions, unfamiliar names hidden among business expenses. Then came messages, careless fragments left behind in email drafts, reminders that told stories Dennis never intended to share. Amaka did not confront him immediately. She understood Dennis too well to expect honesty at the first question. Instead, she traced the edges of the truth, patiently assembling what Dennis believed no one would ever notice. When she finally asked about the irregularities, Dennis laughed. He called her paranoid, emotional, dramatic. He suggested she needed rest, maybe even prayer. The dismissal was more painful than denial. It told Amaka exactly how little he respected her mind. Meanwhile, the mistress grew confident in the shadows, enjoying benefits Dennis justified as necessary. She believed Dennis's version of the story, that his wife was insignificant, dependent, easily controlled. Amaka saw the arrogance forming in both of them, and with each new discovery, her heartbreak transformed into something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous than anger. Betrayal has a way of clarifying everything it touches. Once Amaka accepted the truth, the fog lifted completely. She stopped seeking reassurance from Dennis and stopped hoping for honesty. Instead, she focused inward, strengthening herself quietly. She began organizing information carefully, saving copies, memorizing patterns, backing up data. Dennis mistook her silence for resignation, never questioning why she no longer argued or pleaded. He didn't realize that silence had become a form of preparation. Amaka understood now that the marriage she thought she had was already gone. What remained was knowledge, hard, undeniable, and powerful. And knowledge, she realized, could not be laughed away. The confrontation came on an ordinary evening, which somehow made it worse. There was no shouting at first, no dramatic accusations. Amaka simply laid the evidence before Dennis, printed messages, highlighted transactions, timelines that spoke louder than emotion ever could. Dennis stared at the papers briefly, then laughed. Not nervously, not defensively. He laughed as though she had inconvenienced him with something trivial. His response stunned her. There was no apology, no attempt to explain. Instead, he accused her of invading his privacy, of crossing boundaries she had no right to cross. He twisted the narrative effortlessly, turning himself into the victim and her into the problem. The cruelty of his composure cut deeper than rage ever could. In that moment, Amaka realized she was married to a man who felt no guilt, only annoyance at being exposed. Dennis wasted no time asserting power. He reminded Amaka that everything around them belonged to him. The house, the accounts, the life they had built. He spoke of ownership with confidence, as though years of her contribution had never existed. Within days, he made his decision final. She was no longer welcome. Dennis framed it as practicality, claiming separation would be cleaner if she left immediately. Amaka packed slowly, deliberately. She did not argue. She did not beg. Instead, she observed everything around her with a clarity sharpened by betrayal. She copied documents. She backed up files. She memorized details Dennis had grown careless about. He watched her with indifference, convinced he had already won. He didn't realize she was gathering more than belongings. She was collecting leverage. When Amaka finally walked out of the house, she carried only a small bag and an even smaller expression. Dennis stood behind her, unmoved, certain that poverty and humiliation would break her. What he failed to understand was that being underestimated had always been Amaka's greatest advantage. As she stepped into the uncertain night, grief weighed heavily on her, but beneath it was something steadier, something resolute. Dennis believed the marriage had ended on his terms. He believed the story was over. In truth, it had only just begun. Dennis did not wait long after Amaka left before rewriting the story in his favor. To friends, colleagues, and extended family, he presented himself as the wronged husband, patient, generous, finally freed from a woman who refused to know her place. At social gatherings, he spoke casually about the divorce, his tone confident, even amused. When someone mentioned court, Dennis laughed and waved it off as a formality. He bragged openly about his lawyer, describing him as ruthless and expensive, the kind of man who ended cases before they began. Amaka's name came up only as a punchline. Dennis told anyone who would listen that she planned to represent herself. The reaction he received pleased him greatly: disbelief, mockery, pity. It confirmed everything he believed about her weakness. The conversation soon turned into something uglier. Dennis began making wagers, small at first, drinks, dinners, favors, betting that Amaka would walk out of court with nothing. As his confidence grew, so did the stakes. He boasted that the judge would barely listen to her, that the case would be over in minutes. Laughter followed him wherever he told the story. Even those who felt uncomfortable stayed silent, unwilling to challenge his certainty. Dennis fed on the attention, mistaking approval for truth. Each laugh hardened his arrogance, pushing him further into the belief that power alone determined outcomes. He never considered the possibility of resistance, let alone defeat. What Dennis failed to understand was that every joke he made sharpened the blade he would later face. His public confidence spread quickly, reaching ears he never anticipated. Some people listened closely, quietly reassessing the man they thought they knew. Dennis mistook silence for agreement, never realizing that arrogance often announces itself louder than truth. The bet became more than money. It became his pride. And pride, once placed on the line, rarely survives unchallenged. Dennis's mockery did not remain confined to social spaces. It followed Amaka into private interactions, slipping into conversations like poison disguised as humor. When they spoke about logistics surrounding the divorce, Dennis's tone was sharp, condescending. He spoke slowly, as if addressing a child, emphasizing words he believed were beyond her understanding. Every sentence carried the assumption of superiority. Amaka listened quietly, responding only when necessary. Dennis interpreted her restraint as submission, mistaking calm for defeat. His confidence grew reckless. One afternoon, as discussions turned briefly heated, Dennis leaned forward and delivered the words that would linger long after the conversation ended. He told her she should have stayed in the kitchen. That ambition never suited women like her. He laughed afterward, satisfied with the cruelty of the statement. To him, it was just another reminder of hierarchy, another attempt to shrink her into obedience. Amaka felt the sting deeply, but she did not react. She absorbed the insult, allowing it to settle into memory. Dennis did not realize that humiliation, when quietly endured, transforms into something far more dangerous than anger. That moment marked a shift inside Amaka. It clarified what remained unclear. Dennis did not simply want separation. He wanted erasure. He wanted her to believe she was nothing without him. Instead of breaking her, his words anchored her resolve. Amaka understood then that dignity would not be restored through pleading or compromise. It would come through exposure. Dennis had underestimated the weight of his own words, unaware they would soon return to confront him in a place where laughter carried consequences. As the court date approached, Dennis's confidence wavered slightly, not enough to show publicly, but enough to provoke impatience. He began reaching out more frequently, demanding updates, questioning Amaka's intentions. When she remained vague, his tone shifted from dismissive to sharp. Dennis had always relied on control, and uncertainty made him uncomfortable. He needed reassurance that the narrative remained in his favor. The night before court, Dennis confronted Amaka privately. His voice was low, calculated, stripped of humor. He warned her that pursuing the case would have consequences. He spoke of influence, connections, and the ease with which lives could be disrupted. He suggested she withdraw quietly, framing the threat as advice. Amaka listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. Dennis mistook her silence for fear. What he didn't notice was the phone placed discreetly nearby, recording every word. Amaka had learned that power often exposes itself when it believes it cannot be challenged. When Dennis finished, he expected a response: tears, hesitation, retreat. He received none. Amaka simply nodded and ended the conversation. Alone afterward, she reviewed the recording carefully, ensuring clarity, ensuring precision. The threat did not frighten her. It confirmed everything she already knew. Dennis believed intimidation was protection. He did not realize he had just handed her another weapon. After the threat, Amaka withdrew completely, not out of fear, but out of focus. She stopped answering unnecessary calls and limited conversations to essentials. The small room she stayed in became her private world, stripped of comfort and distraction. Papers covered the table, sorted into careful piles. Each document carried a memory, each date connected to a decision Dennis thought no one would ever trace. Amaka approached preparation with discipline rather than desperation. She woke early, slept late, and measured her days by progress rather than time. There were moments when exhaustion pressed heavily on her chest, when doubt whispered that she was walking into humiliation. But she learned to silence doubt the same way she had silenced herself for years, by refusing to give it a voice. This time, however, silence was no longer surrender. It was control. Amaka studied with intensity that surprised even her. She read legal materials repeatedly, not skimming for comfort, but dissecting them for understanding. She practiced explaining facts out loud, training herself to speak with clarity rather than emotion. Every argument was refined until it could stand without sympathy. She revisited bank statements and contracts until she could recall figures without hesitation. Dennis had always believed she followed instructions blindly. He never imagined she understood the systems behind them. That misconception became her advantage. Each night, she reviewed her evidence again, asking herself what Dennis would deny, what he would mock, what he would forget. She prepared answers before questions were asked. Preparation became protection. What weighed most heavily on Amaka was not the legal risk, but the loneliness of the process. There was no applause, no encouragement, no witness to the effort she poured into those days. Yet solitude sharpened her resolve. She understood that the courtroom would not reward tears or history. It would reward precision. By the time she closed her file for the final time, fear no longer had space inside her. Dennis believed power came from intimidation and money. Amaka had learned that power could also come from patience, discipline, and knowing more than the person who thought you knew nothing at all. The courtroom felt colder than Amaka expected, its air heavy with quiet judgment. Wooden benches creaked softly as people settled, whispering in low voices. Amaka entered alone, her presence drawing subtle attention. Some faces showed curiosity, others pity. She walked steadily, her brown file pressed firmly against her side. When Dennis arrived moments later, the atmosphere shifted. He entered confidently, dressed sharply, flanked by his lawyer. His posture announced victory long before proceedings began. He glanced at Amaka, registered her solitude, and smiled. Dennis laughed openly, the sound echoing louder than decorum allowed. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering something that made them both smile. His laughter was not nervous, it was triumphant, mocking, assured. The sound carried across the room, drawing brief glances from the judge's bench and quiet murmurs from the gallery. Dennis did not care. He wanted the moment seen. To him, Amaka, standing alone, was proof of her foolishness. Nearby, the mistress sat composed and confident, her expression carefully neutral, but her posture relaxed. She believed the narrative Dennis had sold her, that this case was a formality, that Amaka would crumble under pressure. The arrogance in the room thickened, feeding on shared assumptions. Amaka did not respond to the laughter. She did not look at Dennis or acknowledge the whispers. She took her seat calmly, placing her file on the table with deliberate care. Inside, her heart beat steadily, not with fear, but with awareness. She recognized the moment for what it was, Dennis's final performance before reality interrupted. He believed laughter was power. He believed confidence was victory. What he did not understand was that arrogance, once recorded by witnesses, becomes a liability. As the judge prepared to enter, Amaka inhaled slowly. Dennis was still smiling. He did not yet know how quickly that smile would disappear. When the judge entered, the courtroom rose and settled into silence that felt heavier than noise. Dennis straightened in his seat, confidence still resting easily on his shoulders. Amaka stood when required, her movements measured and respectful. Proceedings began formally, and Dennis's lawyer was invited to speak first. He rose smoothly, voice polished and rehearsed, presenting Dennis as a diligent provider who had generously supported his wife for years. The narrative was clean, confident, and carefully framed. Amaka listened without interruption, noting how easily her history was summarized into convenient half-truths. The lawyer emphasized her lack of legal representation, subtly, with a tone that suggested foolishness rather than fact. Dennis watched her closely, waiting for discomfort, for embarrassment. None came. When it was Amaka's turn, the judge looked at her for a long moment before speaking. He asked calmly if she was certain she wished to represent herself. The question carried no mockery, only caution. Amaka answered clearly, confirming her decision without hesitation. She stood slowly, arranging her papers with care. Her voice, when she began, was steady and unhurried. She started with dates, not emotions. She referenced documents before memories. One by one, she laid out facts Dennis did not expect her to articulate with such clarity. The courtroom began to shift. Whispers faded. Dennis's lawyer stiffened slightly, adjusting his posture as he listened more closely. Amaka continued methodically, presenting bank statements, timelines, and signed agreements. She explained her role in Dennis's financial structure calmly, without exaggeration or accusation. The judge leaned forward slightly, signaling attention. Dennis's smile weakened, replaced by confusion. This was not the flustered woman he expected. This was someone prepared. For the first time that morning, the room was no longer watching Dennis. It was watching Amaka. As Amaka spoke, Dennis shifted in his seat. He had assumed her confidence would fade under scrutiny, but instead it strengthened. Each document she presented seemed to contradict assumptions he had relied on for years. Dennis's lawyer attempted to interrupt, raising objections that sounded automatic rather than strategic. The judge allowed Amaka to continue, his patience signaling interest rather than indulgence. Dennis felt an unfamiliar tension coil in his chest. This was not going according to plan. Amaka transitioned seamlessly from documents to explanations, demonstrating an understanding of financial flow that surprised even herself. She spoke of co-signed loans, negotiated terms, and operational decisions Dennis had taken credit for publicly. She clarified that her absence from ownership records was not due to lack of involvement, but deliberate exclusion. Dennis's lawyer objected again, questioning relevance. The judge overruled him calmly. The word relevance lingered in the air, heavier than intended. Dennis swallowed hard, his confidence visibly thinning. The courtroom's attention narrowed. Faces that once showed amusement now reflected curiosity. Dennis glanced briefly at his lawyer, searching for reassurance. None came. Amaka's delivery remained composed, free of emotion yet rich with implication. She was not attacking Dennis. She was dismantling a narrative. And narratives, once exposed, rarely survive intact. Amaka paused briefly before introducing her next piece of evidence. The pause was deliberate, allowing the weight of what she had already presented to settle. Then she requested permission to submit another exhibit. The judge nodded. Dennis's lawyer frowned slightly, sensing a shift he could not yet define. Amaka labeled the document clearly, Exhibit F. The name meant nothing, yet, as the document was reviewed, murmurs spread through the room. It was a sworn affidavit from Dennis's mistress. The woman seated confidently moments earlier stiffened visibly. The affidavit detailed shared plans, promised assets, and financial arrangements Dennis had carefully hidden. The mistress's statements contradicted Dennis's earlier claims, exposing inconsistencies he could not easily explain. Dennis's breath caught. His lawyer flipped through the pages quickly, his composure faltering. This was not part of the strategy. The mistress's confidence collapsed under scrutiny. She shifted in her seat, realizing too late that Dennis's assurances had been hollow. The courtroom buzzed with restrained reaction. Dennis's smile was gone entirely now, replaced by panic. Exhibit F had done more than expose an affair. It had introduced proof Dennis could not dismiss as emotion or misunderstanding. For the first time, Dennis understood that Amaka had not come to defend herself. She had come to reveal him. Dennis lost control without realizing the exact moment it happened. 1 second he was seated, trying to maintain the appearance of calm. The next, his voice rose sharply, cutting across the courtroom before his lawyer could stop him. He protested loudly, accusing Amaka of deception, of plotting, of embarrassment tactics meant to destroy his reputation. The sound of his voice echoed unpleasantly against the courtroom walls, breaking the careful order the judge had maintained. Heads turned. Pens paused. The judge lifted his gaze slowly, his expression firm but unreadable. Dennis's lawyer stood quickly, attempting to restrain him, whispering urgently for him to sit down. Dennis ignored him. Years of unchecked authority spilled out in raw frustration. This was not the confident man who had laughed earlier. This was a man unaccustomed to resistance, startled by it. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp, deliberate. Silence followed immediately, but the damage was done. Dennis's composure, carefully built over years of dominance, had fractured in front of witnesses. When the judge warned Dennis sternly about decorum, the shift in power became unmistakable. Dennis sat back down slowly, his breathing uneven, his hands clenched tightly against the table. His lawyer avoided his eyes, already calculating how much ground had been lost. Across the room, the mistress no longer held her earlier confidence. She stared down at her lap, shoulders stiff, fully aware that the story she had believed and benefited from was unraveling in public. Amaka remained standing when permitted, her posture steady, her expression composed. She did not react to Dennis's outburst or seek satisfaction from it. Instead, she allowed the moment to breathe. The courtroom absorbed everything, the arrogance, the panic, the contrast. Where Dennis unraveled, Amaka steadied herself further. The judge listened intently as proceedings resumed, his questions now sharper, his patience thinner. Every answer Dennis gave afterward sounded defensive, weighed down by what had already been revealed. From that moment on, Dennis's authority never fully returned. Each time he shifted in his seat, it drew attention. Each whisper to his lawyer carried desperation instead of strategy. The courtroom had seen beneath the surface, and it could not be unseen. Amaka spoke again only when invited, clarifying points raised by the affidavit without emotion or embellishment. She did not attack. She allowed truth to stand on its own. The contrast between them grew starker with every passing minute. Dennis had built his identity on control, believing confidence alone could bend reality. Now stripped of that illusion, he looked smaller, exposed by his own behavior. The mask had slipped, and no amount of correction could put it back in place. After the tension settled, Amaka requested permission to submit one final exhibit for the day. Her voice remained calm, but the room sensed the gravity of what was coming. Dennis's lawyer hesitated, rising slightly as if to object, then stopping himself. The judge nodded, instructing Amaka to proceed. She explained carefully that this exhibit addressed conduct that occurred outside the courtroom, but directly affected the integrity of the case. Dennis reacted instantly, denying the claim before she finished speaking. His voice cracked slightly, betraying fear. He insisted she was lying, that she was fabricating evidence out of spite. The speed of his denial worked against him. The judge raised a hand, silencing him, and instructed Amaka to continue uninterrupted. Amaka played the recording. Dennis's voice filled the courtroom, low, deliberate, unmistakable. The threat was clear, delivered calmly, framed as advice, but weighted with implication. As the recording continued, Dennis's face drained of color. His lawyer closed his eyes briefly, shoulders slumping as the realization settled. The mistress looked up sharply, recognition dawning in her expression as she understood the full scope of Dennis's character. No one spoke. The sound of Dennis's own words carried more weight than any accusation Amaka could have made. When the recording ended, the silence that followed was suffocating. Even the smallest movement felt intrusive. The judge sat very still, his expression unreadable, his disappointment unmistakable. The judge spoke slowly, each word measured. He warned Dennis sternly about intimidation and obstruction, making it clear such behavior would weigh heavily in his considerations going forward. Dennis remained seated, stunned, unable to meet anyone's eyes. His confidence had collapsed completely, replaced by the awareness that he had exposed himself beyond recovery. Amaka returned to her seat quietly, her hand steady. She had not raised her voice. She had not argued. She had simply allowed Dennis to reveal himself. In that moment, the case shifted decisively. Dennis had believed power meant control over others. He learned too late that true power lies in restraint, and that intimidation, once documented, becomes a confession. After the recording was admitted, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed permanently. The judge called for a brief recess, not out of confusion, but out of deliberation. When proceedings resumed, his tone was markedly different, firmer, slower, and more deliberate. He addressed Dennis directly, outlining concerns that had emerged regarding transparency, asset management, and conduct. Dennis stood when instructed, his earlier arrogance replaced by rigid tension. The judge explained that the court could no longer proceed under the assumptions initially presented. The credibility of Dennis's testimony had been compromised, and the integrity of the original settlement required reconsideration. Dennis's lawyer attempted to interject, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him. This was no longer a debate, it was a correction. The judge announced that the divorce settlement would be reopened fully, citing evidence of concealed assets and intimidation. A forensic financial audit was ordered immediately, covering Dennis's business accounts, property holdings, and transfers made during the marriage and separation. The words landed heavily. Dennis's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of consequence settling in. The mistress stared straight ahead, unmoving, as though motion itself might draw attention. Amaka listened quietly, her face composed, absorbing the gravity of what was unfolding. She understood what this meant, not just legally, but personally. Dennis had lost control of the narrative completely. The judge continued, granting Amaka temporary possession of the marital home pending the audit's outcome. The decision was not framed as punishment, but as protection. Dennis nodded stiffly, unable to object. For the first time, authority stood firmly against him. The power dynamic that had governed his marriage and his life had been dismantled in a single session. Court was adjourned for the day. Dennis remained seated long after others began to rise. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different, lighter, yet charged with unspoken reactions. Journalists lingered nearby, sensing a story larger than a simple divorce. People who had laughed with Dennis days earlier now avoided eye contact. Conversations lowered as Amaka passed, curiosity replacing mockery. Dennis emerged moments later, his expression guarded, his lawyer whispering urgently beside him. The mistress followed at a distance, no longer walking confidently at his side. The separation between them was unmistakable. Dennis felt the shift keenly. The laughter that once followed him was gone, replaced by silence and speculation. He realized too late that public confidence, once lost, does not return easily. Friends who had encouraged his bravado now disappeared, unwilling to be associated with scandal. The bets he had made were remembered, their echoes sharp and humiliating. Dennis said nothing, retreating into the car without ceremony. Amaka walked away calmly, her steps unhurried. She did not smile. Victory, she knew, was not something to celebrate loudly. It was something to carry quietly. For the first time in years, she felt grounded, not triumphant, but restored. The audit did not begin with drama. It began with emails, formal letters, and deadlines that didn't care about Dennis's pride. Requests arrived for statements, tax filings, property documents, company ledgers, and proof of transfers that Dennis had once treated like harmless convenience. At first, he acted irritated, telling his lawyer it was routine. But routine became relentless. Every document he delayed triggered another request. Every gap in his records attracted more attention. He started spending long hours in his office after closing time, opening drawers he hadn't opened in years, searching for papers he once assumed would never matter. He called accountants, former staff, and bank contacts, trying to rebuild a trail he had deliberately scattered. Some answered politely, others avoided him entirely. It was not the audit alone that shook him, it was the feeling of being watched by a system that did not fear him. For the first time, Dennis's world stopped bending around his confidence. Partners who once returned calls immediately began rescheduling. Deals that were nearly signed suddenly needed more due diligence. Invitations to meetings dried up, replaced by cautious messages and a polite distance that felt worse than open rejection. Dennis realized that reputation is a currency, and his was losing value daily. He began noticing how people looked at him, carefully, like they were measuring his risk. Even his lawyer, once bold, now spoke in warnings. Say less. Do nothing without writing. Stop calling people. The pressure followed Dennis everywhere. He grew impatient at home, snapping at staff, losing sleep, checking his phone repeatedly as if a call might restore control. But every update from the audit sounded the same. More questions, more scrutiny, more evidence forming a picture he could not rewrite. Meanwhile, Amaka's participation was steady and clean. She responded when contacted, submitted what she had, clarified timelines, and let the facts speak without bitterness. Her calm unsettled Dennis more than anger ever could. He had always believed her strength depended on his approval, that without him she would crumble. Yet the process revealed something different. She understood his structure better than he did. Dennis felt trapped in a narrowing corridor of consequence. The audit wasn't just reviewing his finances, it was reviewing his character. And Dennis could sense with growing dread that the system was discovering what Amaka had known for years. His confidence had been a costume, and beneath it was carelessness disguised as power. Dennis requested to see Amaka again, not through threats this time, but through a carefully worded message that sounded almost respectful. He suggested they talk like adults and settle things quietly. Amaka agreed, choosing a neutral public place during the day, somewhere predictable and safe. Dennis arrived early, restless, scanning the environment as if expecting judgment to walk in behind her. When Amaka entered, he stood too quickly, trying to reclaim old habits of control, pulling out a chair, forcing politeness, performing calm. Amaka sat without ceremony, her expression composed, her posture steady. Dennis began speaking immediately, as though silence might swallow him. He complained about the audit, about pressure, about how things had gone too far. He mentioned the business, his stress, his reputation. Not once did he begin with an apology. Not once did he call what he did betrayal. He framed everything as inconvenience caused by her refusal to let things go. Amaka listened until he ran out of breath, then answered slowly, choosing her words with precision. She told him the case did not go too far, his decisions did. She reminded him that he laughed when she entered court, and that laughter was not a mistake. It was a summary of how he saw her. Dennis tried to interrupt, claiming he had been angry, provoked, manipulated. Amaka stopped him gently. She said she did not represent herself in court to humiliate him. She did it because she knew the truth better than anyone he could hire to speak for him. Dennis's face tightened. He accused her of planning revenge, of waiting quietly to destroy him. Amaka shook her head. She told him he had trained her to be quiet for years, and he mistook that quiet for emptiness. I wasn't planning revenge, she said evenly. I was learning how to survive you. The words landed harder than shouting. Dennis stared at her, searching for the old Amaka who would soften, who would absorb blame to keep peace. But the old peace was gone. Dennis tried a different angle, promising change, suggesting reconciliation, offering financial support, as though generosity could erase harm. Amaka did not insult him. She did not gloat. She simply refused the bargain. She told him she would not return to a life where dignity depended on his mood. Dennis's hands trembled slightly around his phone. He asked, almost quietly now, what she wanted from him. Amaka answered that she wanted nothing personal, only what was fair, only what the law recognized, only what he had tried to deny. She told him his biggest mistake wasn't the affair alone. It was believing she was too small to respond. Dennis's eyes dropped. For the first time in their marriage, he had no leverage left, no money he could wave, no intimidation he could deploy, no public confidence to hide behind. He looked like a man meeting consequences for the first time. Amaka stood, nodded once, and walked away without drama. Dennis remained seated, finally understanding that the conversation had not ended because she was done speaking. It ended because she had nothing left to beg for. The conclusion did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with documents, signatures, and quiet finality. When the court's decisions were implemented, Dennis felt it not as a single blow, but as a steady dismantling. Financial access changed. Oversight tightened. People who once feared him now treated him like a liability to manage. He moved through his days with caution, speaking less, watching more, discovering that the world he dominated had limits he never respected. The mistress was no longer a proud companion. She became a reminder of promises that failed under scrutiny. She distanced herself, not out of sudden morality, but out of self-preservation. Dennis tried to salvage appearances, but the damage was deeper than gossip. It was structural. It was legal. It was permanent. He learned what it felt like to be questioned, to be doubted, to be reduced to evidence and paperwork, the same way he once reduced Amaka to silence and convenience. Amaka's progress looked different. It was quieter, slower, and more real. She reclaimed pieces of herself that had been paused for years: education, personal goals, friendships she had neglected, interests Dennis once mocked as useless. She didn't rebuild to impress anyone. She rebuilt because she wanted a life where her voice was normal, not a rebellion. Some mornings she still felt grief, not for Dennis, but for the version of herself that believed love required disappearance. Yet even grief had changed shape. It no longer weakened her. It reminded her what she would never accept again. She became deliberate with boundaries, careful with trust, and patient with her own healing. Her strength wasn't loud. It wasn't performative. It was the kind of strength that shows in choices, choosing peace without surrender, choosing dignity without applause. One afternoon, long after the courtroom had emptied and the audit had settled into record, Amaka found herself smiling unexpectedly, not because everything was perfect, but because she finally felt free inside her own mind. She remembered Dennis's laughter in court, not with pain anymore, but with clarity. That laugh had been his last illusion of control. He thought confidence could erase truth. He thought mockery could replace evidence. He thought her silence meant she was powerless. In the end, the law did not reward noise. It rewarded what could be proven. Amaka didn't win because she was lucky. She won because she refused to be erased. And Dennis learned the hardest lesson of all. The person you underestimate the most is often the person who knows you best. Please like and subscribe. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for watching to the end. Don't forget to come back for the next amazing tale yet.